Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time talking about a variety of different issues that I think you're going to find very helpful. And as we get into this, I'm hoping that if nothing else, we'll be able to answer some of your questions, because we're going to be spending just a little bit of time today talking about the vaccines and the virus and that kind of thing. We'll get to that later in the week when we're bringing an expert in maybe to answer some of your questions. But it really brings us back to the first article I've posted here today about zero-risk Western society. And so let me just, if I can, for a few minutes, kind of focus on the pandemic and what has taken place, and maybe even the desire for having no risk. Now, if you want to have no risk, well, then maybe you shouldn't fly an airplane. CNN's actually made a big mistake making a comment about that was statistically erroneous. Of course, you maybe wouldn't want to ride a motorcycle. You wouldn't want to go rock climbing. You might want, you start thinking, and maybe I should just stay at home all the time. And that's why I posted this first article by Andrew Mikta. So I'm going to read that kind of generally. Then I'm going to go back, if we can, for just a few minutes and see what we can do to help you deal with a couple of these issues, because one of the things I want you to develop is an ability to certainly understand how to exercise a level of discernment. So today you're going to notice in the first hour, I'll spend a little bit of time quoting from some individuals that tend to be more on the liberal side. And you might say, why do I do that? Well, first of all, it is really helpful to recognize that even though sometimes we wonder if the whole nation has lost its mind, especially some on the left, there's still some at least honest liberals saying, no, wait a minute. I think you've overreacted to some of that. So that's also helpful if you end up talking with somebody who maybe disagrees with you. So that's part of what we will talk about. We will get into some of the other issues. Can't avoid Georgia, because we just, of course, had the Masters, and we'll talk about an individual that won and how in some respects you have the situation that seems to imply that, well, because we're concerned about the particular election law passed in Georgia, we can't have the All-Star game there in Atlanta and has to go to Denver, but we still have to keep the Masters in Augusta. And so we'll talk about that as well and get into a couple of other issues. Eventually, of course, we'll get into the issue of gun violence and Second Amendment and much more. And that's just the first hour, assuming we can cover all that in 1 hour. Next hour, we're going to focus on a book that has come out, Before You Split, Find What You Really Want for the Future of Your Marriage. Toni Nieuwhof is with us, and we'll be talking with her in about an hour. Has worked as a divorce lawyer and sort of has heard everything. And there is certainly a real concern right now that I think some of us have begun to surface, that indeed, because of the lockdown and because of the pandemic and because of some of the strains on marriage, divorce rates might even increase. And of course, divorce has always been a problem in our society. And as I've said before, sometimes you have couples that are going to the divorce courts to choose not to resolve an issue that nevertheless later on is actually a source of some healing for a marriage. So we'll get into some of those issues. And throughout the week, we're going to be covering a lot of different topics. So I hope you can stay with us every single day. First point, though, is by Andrew Mikta. I just sort of discovered him a couple of months ago, and an individual that every time I turn around, I find another article by him that I like, and it's entitled The Zero Risk Western Society. If you go to the website, you'll even see that they have a picture there from a mall in California, where you basically have one person that's allowed to sit on one end of this bench and one on the other, but only two people can sit on this very long bench because, after all, COVID, and that becomes the justification for just about everything. Well, interestingly enough, he points out that in a year of COVID pandemic, it has transformed, he says, the freest and most affluent societies in the history of the West beyond recognition in ways that probably we never would have imagined, and goes into some of the actual examples, but I'll simply skip through that to go to the point where he says that a year into the collective pandemic psychosis, a few seem to remember that the lockdowns were to serve as a temporary expedient to last about a few weeks so as to flatten the curve and to ensure that our medical services would not become overburdened. And so if nothing else, he's reminding us that the original idea was we weren't supposed to be doing all of this in the way we're doing it right now, but nevertheless, it has changed everything. He goes on to say that few politicians or media pundits bothered to ask the obvious question of why a life threatened by COVID deserved to be saved before all other lives threatened by, say, untreated cancers or untreated heart conditions, or why the rights of free citizens, such as the right to earn a living, to interact with one's family and friends, to educate one's children, or simply to live in freedom, a right that millions have died across history to preserve, should be sacrificed so that we could, as one politician recently asserted, conquer this virus. And he says there's no doubt and no denying that the pathogen caused a serious illness, especially among the elderly and people with underlying medical conditions. He goes on to say we should take precautions to limit its spread and develop vaccines against it, and most of all therapeutics to treat the infected. But its impact is nowhere near the epidemics that have plagued humanity throughout its existence. And he reminds us of just a few. I mean, the Black Death killed an estimated 50 million people, and perhaps amounted to anywhere from 25% to 60%, depending on which historian you quote, actually affecting the European population. Smallpox in America after 1520 and other diseases brought to the New World were believed to have killed 90 to 95% of the native population. The Spanish flu, even in 1918, killed probably 20 million people. And then you have Asian flu, and he goes through even AIDS, HIV, and all the rest, just to remind us that when we are talking about COVID-19, of course, everybody's memory is only recent and not historical. We tend to think it is so much more tragic than some of those others. And then he runs the numbers, and I won't take any of the numbers there, but he finally senses that I mention these numbers not to make light of the tragic impact of each individual loss of life, but to take a broader view of the scope of the pandemic versus the impact that the measures to combat it have had across our societies, especially the massive loss of the gross domestic product, the destruction of small businesses, the unraveling of our educational system with the impact falling predominantly on the young, social pathologies including surging alcoholism, drug addiction, and domestic violence. And if nothing else, he recognizes that, as we'll talk about after the break, we're now talking about different strands of the virus. And now that we are, I think we have to recognize that most likely we're going to have to recognize that this virus in one form or another probably will always be with us. And so instead, we should try to mitigate the risk, because we'll never be able to eliminate it. And most of all, there are things worse than that as well, and that's the quality of life being destroyed, and even the lack of given the opportunity to pursue the talents that God has given to us. And so if nothing else, he concludes by saying, we may wish we could live in a world with zero risk. But that's not the world we live in, and we're just going to have to recognize that, as we'll get into some of the facts and figures and statistics in just a minute, we can't give you a zero-risk Western society. We can do the best to try to mitigate that risk, but we can never completely eliminate it. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other Democratic House members considered removing an elected member of Congress and replacing her with another Democrat. That did not happen because the Democrat decided to withdraw, leaving the elected Iowa Republican in the House of Representatives. This incident raises lots of questions. The Constitution does allow Congress to disqualify an election, but that power hasn't been used in decades and has been reserved when there has been some serious misconduct. The congressional election was very close, but that hardly gave the House leadership the right to overturn an election. You may not have even heard about this possible action, which is another reason why I mention it. Imagine if 2 years from now, Republicans gain control of the House and the new Speaker of the House, likely Kevin McCarthy, decided to disqualify an elected Democrat from serving in the House. Do you think the media would ignore that abuse of power? I think we know the answer. The reason for this controversy surfaced because the election was so close. The Republican won over the Democrat by merely 6 votes out of 394,000 votes. The next time you hear someone wonder if one vote counts, remind them of this congressional election that was won by 6 votes. I've done commentaries in the past documenting elections where the margin of victory was even less. This incident also illustrates the need for election integrity. As with any election, there were questions about some of the ballots. Should they be counted or not counted? State legislatures in many parts of the country are currently considering legislation or passing legislation that should make our elections more secure. Sloppy rules and arbitrary changes in election law make contested elections more likely. The election in Iowa illustrates why we need to get it right. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to spend some time, if we can, now talking about a couple other aspects of the virus, and then we'll move on to some other topics. And I do this if for no other reason than I think it's really important for you to know how to sort through all the various issues in the news. And certainly one aspect of that is to go to the second article I've posted here today. It talks about the idea that there is a liberal poster who shreds the current COVID panic narrative. And first of all, if you want to understand the narrative, I think Matt Vespa does a good job. He says the fourth wave is going to kill us all. We have variants. We have cases reportedly surging. We have vaccines. But even if you get the shot, you'll have to remain inside and remain in total fear until we get some kind of passport system going. So that's the kind of phraseology you're hearing right now. And one of the reasons why I thought it was so good to post this article is he spends some time quoting from Nate Silver. You might say, okay, who is he? Well, he's with the 538, which is an organization that, for those of us that love baseball, and it was a good weekend for baseball, by the way, especially for Clayton Kershaw, but for a variety of others as well, that he's done quite a bit of analysis of baseball statistics, which are fascinating to me anyway, but he also is probably best known for the fact that in the 2008 election, he predicted accurately what would happen in 49 of the 50 states where Barack Obama won. And so it's very interesting that he was predicting the states that Barack Obama would win, the ones that John McCain would win, and by the right percentage and everything. And so people began to look to him. He published a book shortly thereafter called Sound and Noise. I got that on my shelf. And so I've had a lot of respect for him, even though sometimes on the political issues we might disagree. He is a very good statistician, and you have to appreciate the fact that instead of going along with what maybe some of his fellow liberals would be saying, he's saying, wait a minute, we got a problem here. And that has to do with the fact that you're still getting this drumbeat about how the virus is still wild. We still have all sorts of danger on the horizon. We should be very fearful of these variants. By the way, I am going to, in just a minute, talk about when we look across various borders and we look at some of these hot spots around the world. That would be Brazil and India. That is a reasonable concern, but it's not here in the United States. And so when you started having people talking about there being a surge in the number of cases in the Northeast, this particular article then gives you all sorts of Twitter posts by Nate Silver, one of which says not only is there not a surge, but if you look at the COVID metrics, they're actually declining for New York City. Well, again, if you're making the case for a COVID or vaccine passport, you've got to say things are a lot worse and we really need this kind of protection. Yet he points out that if anything, you look at the 7-day average there in Manhattan, it's the lowest, really, some people are saying, since early December. Then he talks about the fact that in another one of his posts that just 222 COVID deaths reported in the United States, which is the fewest since March 23rd, 2020. So you've got to appreciate the fact that he is, in many cases, aligned with people that would be left of center. But at the same time, he's also dedicated to telling the truth. And that, of course, doesn't fit the narrative that many people are trying to use to argue for lockdowns, to argue for various kinds of vaccine passports and the rest. One other piece I thought I'd quote from this article. He points out that the data series, as you may have guessed, is COVID-19 cases in the United States. Only 11% of you describe the series as rising, so it's strange to see routine descriptions to that effect or even references to a fourth wave. And he says, always check the underlying data for yourself. So he spends some time really trying to criticize the fact that there is always a fair amount of hyperbole, a fair amount of shock value, especially when people write headlines. Sometimes you have to read past the headlines to get some better facts. And he even points out the fact that even when you do look at some of the uptick, it's in places like Michigan, which is going to bring me to my next piece in just a minute ago, because what you are going to see is that there has always been this argument that when we look at Florida, which had removed a mask mandate very early, or Texas, which also removed a mask mandate very early, and Michigan, which has basically been locked down, in many cases you're starting to see a surge, a very significant surge in places like Michigan, and that completely is the opposite of what was being touted by so-called experts and the rest. Unless you think that this whole idea of a fourth wave is just something that he's missing, I think it's helpful that even near the end of the article, which we've posted there, point out that even Anthony Fauci says that he doesn't think there's a fourth wave. Which brings me to another point, because you would at some point maybe hope that some of the people in the press that made such outlandish statements and such dire predictions would come back and say, you know, maybe we were a little bit wrong. You can wait forever for that to be taking place. But this piece by Derek Hunter points out, he says, Democrats are scrambling to understand why their policies related to COVID are falling and failing, while Republican policies are succeeding. And the argument that they're being made is that look at what has happened in a place like Texas, where there were all sorts of arguments about the fact that by ending the mask mandate, this was going to turn Texas into a killing field, and you had similar statements being made in Texas. Yet if you look at this right now, this is what many of the researchers are called the COVID conundrum, in which states which have had some of the strictest measures in the country, that would be Michigan, Pennsylvania, much of New England, those are the places where cases are on the rise, while in the South, and again, this is a quote from a report on Today's Show, states like Arkansas and Texas have reopened business, don't have mask mandates, and are seeing their numbers drop. They tried to come up with some theory that maybe this has to do with infection rates and testing and a number of others. And this article goes on to use Alabama as an example, where they're saying, well, there's not a lot of testing there. But that doesn't work, because then you'd have to say, well, even if there isn't as much testing in Alabama, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are a lot of people walking around that are sick or even going to the hospital. You don't see that happening either. And so it's almost like right now scientists have been grasping for straws, trying to come back to some kind of justification for the lockdowns, for mask mandates, for a passport for those who have actually been vaccinated. And I think the best evidence is to suggest, if nothing else, that we are maybe coming to the other side of this, at least in this country. Although in just a minute I will talk about some of the real concerns coming out of places like Brazil and even India. But just before we take a break, let me mention just one more, because here again is a place where I think it is really appropriate to ask some fundamental questions. CNN the other day posted a piece arguing that it still would be necessary for everybody to wear a mask on the plane because, after all, we recognize, according to their quote, that vaccines are only 90% effective. And so as a result, that means that for every million people that are fully vaccinated who fly, some 100,000 would still become infected. Now, there's a problem with that, and we can get into the statistics, and I've oftentimes said that it would be helpful if in journalism schools they required a journalism student to at least take a class in statistics or in science, because of so many errors that you see time and time again by journalists that don't know how to work statistics or numbers or all the rest. But even if indeed you said, okay, I don't understand all the statistical issues, I love what one person simply pointed out. Wait a minute. We have had millions and millions of people flying right now unvaccinated, and we haven't had hundreds of thousands of those people being infected being on the airplane. So even if you don't understand the background statistics, in this case, this is mixing apples and oranges. Actually, I'm not even sure these would even be the same fruit category, but nevertheless, the statistical analysis was so poorly done that most people caught it instantaneously. CNN should have just taken it down, but instead tried to fix it, and it probably did more harm than good. But even if you don't understand statistics, you have to be sitting there thinking, now, wait a minute, we had probably millions of people now that have flown. Many of them were unvaccinated. And how many people have we ever identified that have ever become infected because of flying in an airplane? And the answer is not very many. So again, you can see that whether you know math or not, sometimes just common sense is enough to have some discernment. Anyway, let's take a break. We've got a few more things to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention that in about a half an hour, we're going to be talking with a former divorce attorney and family law mediator, Toni Nieuwhof, and it's a new book out, Before You Split, Find What You Really Want for the Future of Your Marriage, and so we'll spend some time talking about that. But let me point you to, if nothing else, my commentary today. It's called Disqualifying an Election. Because, as you may know, we have talked about this before on the program, Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other Democratic House members for about a week or two seriously thought about whether or not to remove an elected member of Congress and replace her with another Democrat. Now, that did not happen in part because the Democrat decided to withdraw, leaving the elected Republican from Iowa in that situation. But to me, I thought it really raised a lot of questions that we can talk about now. And the first is, was that even appropriate? Now, to be fair, the Constitution does provide and allow for Congress to disqualify an election, and we've had a few of those in the past, but in most cases, we're talking about where there was serious misconduct or even outright election fraud that could have changed the election. And in this case, the election was very close, but that's the only reason for that. And of course, as you might imagine, the reason that we are even talking about it is because it was not very well covered by the press. And so in the commentary, I point out just kind of a thought experiment. Imagine if 2 years from now, Republicans gain control of the House. That's a real possibility. And so then imagine if the new Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, decided to disqualify an elected Democrat from serving in the House. Do you think the media would cover it? Well, of course. And so here, the media seem to want to ignore at this time, and yet, you know, if the roles were reversed, it would be a major scandal. And I think it just illustrates again why we need to necessarily always believe everything that you see in the media and to check your sources and to read widely. But the other reason I wanted to bring it up was because this was a really close election. There were only 6 votes that separated the Republican from the Democrat out of 394,439 votes. So this is one of the closest elections in the history of Congress. And so I think it illustrates, number one, does one vote count? You bet it does. I mean, just think of this. A half a dozen votes separate the winner from the loser when almost 400,000 votes were cast. And then finally, and this brings us to our next point that we want to get into, and that is, this is why state legislatures right now are doing what they can to make sure that we have some kind of election integrity and we have clear rules. Because even in this election, as in almost every election, there's a question about some of the ballots. Some of the ballots were not counted, and the argument being made, well, you should have counted those. And when the laws are ambiguous, that's dangerous. And so this is why, if nothing else, I salute these different state legislatures doing what they can to try to bring about some level of election integrity. And when we have sloppy rules, when we have arbitrary changes that are sometimes brought about simply because of a federal judge or even a county judge thinking that they can change it, that, of course, is of concern. Which brings us to the Masters. First of all, congratulations to Hideki Matsuyama, who earned the green jacket, and this was a great opportunity for the Masters tournament to actually play out. But you can't help but notice, if you will, the incredible hypocrisy, irony, you can pick your word, because at a time when you've had the argument being made that these laws, in particular this Election Reform Act that was implemented and actually passed and signed, is nothing more than Jim Crow 2.0 and justification for moving the All-Star game from Atlanta, which is 51% African American, to Denver, which is 9% African American. Do you not see the irony there? From a state that actually has more open and liberal election laws than the state to which they moved it. And then after that, then deciding, but we're not going to apply it all to the Masters tournament. And this particular piece by Valerie Richardson said, by rejecting calls to cancel or move the Masters, which concluded Sunday, the Augusta National Golf Club allowed President Joe Biden and Viacom CBS to have it both ways by slamming the state's newly enacted election law without having to pay a price. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you had the president, Joe Biden, telling reporters that first he strongly supported moving the All-Star game from Atlanta. But then once everybody started saying, look who you're really going to hurt, it's not going to hurt Major League Baseball. It's probably not even going to hurt the players, but it is going to hurt all the people that would have been working at the stadium and all the people working in the hotels who would have welcomed all those people to Atlanta for the game. And so then when it came time to be asked about the Masters, it's, well, I think it's up to the Masters. You know, it's reassuring to see that the for-profit operations and businesses speaking up about how they're upset about this, but it illustrates again, if you will, kind of the hypocrisy of the two. And the individual that I wanted to quote, who I thought did a very good job of pointing this out, was, again, one of our liberals that we quote so often, the professor at George Washington Law School. That would be Professor Jonathan Turley. And he posted on his website, one obvious question is why there is a difference between baseball and golf when it comes to anti-racism boycotts. If Georgia is back to being a Jim Crow state, and I'm sure he doesn't agree with that, and a baseball boycott is warranted, why does Biden give the Masters a mulligan? And I think it's a good question. And our friends at the Media Research Center even point out the fact that they said, wait, quote, CBS was all too eager to promote the far-left boycott of Georgia and lobbied businesses to join them, but now they've all dropped all that to air the Masters that were just days ago encouraging people to boycott. So here, CBS was telling people we need to boycott Georgia, but now when it was going to affect our bottom line, because after all, we wanted to be the network to actually broadcast the Masters, then of course nothing was done in that regard. And lest you think no one was calling for that, I found this link to the National Black Justice Coalition that called for the PGA and for Augusta National to pull the tournament from Georgia. So there were people calling for that, but it wasn't in the economic best interest for CBS to do so. So here you go once again with the obvious hypocrisy on a national stage. But before we take a break, let me just also acknowledge that for all of the comments about the laws being like a throwback to Jim Crow, there's pretty good evidence to suggest that actually the laws are probably a very significant compromise. And Gary Bauer puts it this way, because he says, for example, the law that is now going to be implemented does not require signature matching. Maybe that's good, but it also, by eliminating signature matching, might even make it easier for people if all they need to do is have the right number from their driver's license or whatever their ID is. So in some respects, yes, it makes it probably easier. And again, as I pointed out in one particular study done a couple of years ago, they found that sometimes when ballots were rejected for signature matching, they found that 54% of those ballots that were rejected were from African Americans. So if anything, this is a step which eliminates the possibility of any kind of racial issue, but at the same time probably makes it even easier to forge something, because all you need to know is the person's driver license in order to do that. For example, the law also actually does not eliminate or limit no excuse absentee mailing, but now, if nothing else, Georgia is now like about a dozen other states that have adopted no excuse mail-in voting. So in some respects, that is actually much more liberal than what Georgia had before. And again, being one of the states where sometimes these issues of voter fraud have surfaced, oftentimes in those. And while drop box are limited under the new law, let's face it, they weren't even used until the 2020 election. And so you can begin to see that, if anything, the law, rather than being typified as being something as Jim Crow 2.0, actually is probably much more liberal and much more of a compromise than the law that existed before. But you wouldn't know it by watching the comments being made by the president and by various pundits and corporations. And just a good illustration of how that has been completely misrepresented to a point where I don't think the average citizen has any idea of the impact this law will have on the next election. Anyway, let's take a break. We've got more to cover right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Matter of fact, I really kind of started off today talking about zero-risk Western society. And our first caller here, Alex in Georgia, WLPE, would like to address that issue. So, Alex, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for letting me talk on the radio. The only point that I wanted to make is that I've grown up in the church My parents went to Moody Bible Institute, and all the people around me in the culture that I'm in predominantly believe that God wants us to be good stewards of our relationships, of our money, of our houses. Unfortunately, that leads us to the belief that God doesn't want us to risk anything. And risking anything is like being a bad steward. You know, you might lose this, you might lose that. God wouldn't want you to risk anything.
Well, that's a good point, because, you know, that may be, I don't know your age, but I have noticed among the younger generation, because we've talked about this before in a Millennial Roundtable, and the book Coddling the American Mind talks about this idea of safetyism, that you want to eliminate risk. You don't want to ever do anything that would jeopardize your safety. And so sometimes I think even in the Christian world, we've tended to equate stewardship and safety. And certainly you would love to be as safe as possible. I want to keep my children, my grandchildren safe. I want to keep myself safe. And that gets into wise use of resources, having a burglar alarm, or, you know, all sorts of things that we can come up with. But at the same time, if you never take risks, if you think about it, most of the heroes in the Bible took some very significant risks. So we have got to get away from this aversion to risk equals stewardship. And I think you've got a really good point, which I've not really brought up, but I appreciate you bringing it up.
You're welcome.
Well, again, thank you for joining us. If you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I do commend to you the first article here by Andrew Mikta. Never had him on the program, really don't know much about him, but every time, once in a while, I come across an article that I think's really good, and then I'll say, oh, there's that byline again. So I get to need to know a little bit more about him. But the zero-risk Western society is an issue, and I think Alex raised another good question. We maybe even in the Christian world have come to identify that maybe stewardship is safety and stewardship is being adverse to risk. Yet if you think about it, everything from the gospel to some of the great heroes of the Bible were people that took risks, and certainly that is part of that. And the success of the American experiment has always been as entrepreneurs being willing to take risk and be willing to put themselves, their time, their effort, and everything into a venture that may or may not be successful. And we may get talking about that tomorrow, especially when I'm going to be doing a teaching about the Federal Reserve and about our funds and a variety of other things. We'll get into that. But let me mention one of the other articles I've posted here for you to read. And this one is a quote from another one of our liberal friends, and that's Kevin Drum. Matt Vespa talks about the fact that he's a liberal blogger, used to be with Mother Jones, okay? So you can see he's a liberal progressive. Now he's on with his own blog. But again, he's one of those individuals which is honest to the facts. I remember a while back, for example, that he actually agreed with the decision that people made to not prohibit people on a terror watch list from buying guns, and pointed out that, you know, you even had Cub Scouts on those erroneously, and so he's talked about that. He was the one that pointed out that after in Irvine, California, they reopened for school, that they didn't suffer a surge in COVID-19 and some others. Well, anyway, he's actually helped us understand another issue, and that is he's been looking at FBI data and pointing out that anti-black crime is dropping. And here's his piece, which I'll just read, and you can read it in its entirety because we've posted it on the website, pointofview.net. He said a number of people, including me, have posited that the Obama era produced a white backlash that eventually elected Donald Trump as president. So he acknowledges that he was erroneous, like a lot of other people in the past. He says there's some evidence to support this, but it sure doesn't show up in the hate crime statistics. Hate crimes against black people plummeted by nearly half during Obama's term and have pretty much stayed there ever since. This is despite the fact that presumably the Obama administration put greater focus on hate crimes than either George Bush or Donald Trump. Violent assaults on black people have gone down by nearly half, he says, by 2005, far more than violent assaults in general. In this case, however, the decline has been fairly steady over the entire period. He goes on to say that the FBI is not the only authority on hate crimes. There is also the NCVS, which is not the only authority on victimization. Still, they're generally well respected and use the same methodology from year to year, and this probably represents reality pretty well. He says, I've been accused rightfully of constantly telling you that things are better than you think. The reason is simple. He says, whenever I look into something, it very often turns out to be better than the media focus would have you believe. And then he has a graph. He says in the graph, he noted that the number of racially motivated incidents deemed anti-black went from 126 per million in 2004 to 70 per million in 2019. Now, Matt Vesta goes on and said, could we do better? Sure, we could always do better on the issue of race, but he's pointing out that the reason this just gets ignored all the time is that it sort of violates the narrative, and that is that there is more racism, there's more attacks on African Americans, and yet the facts simply do not bear them out. And this comes from a liberal blogger who has found on more than one occasion when the media says it's really bad, it usually isn't really bad. And that brings me to one other piece that we've posted here as well. It's just a reminder of the fact that when Tucker Carlson came on the air last week talking about gun violence, he points out that if you're really serious about gun violence, wouldn't you want to take guns off the street? I think that's kind of the argument, right? And he points out that the police commander for the District of Columbia, John Haynes, actually has wanted his focus on anything but. And Tucker Carlson said the party that thinks guns cause violence is no longer pulling them off the street. Why? Because according to the D.C. commander, that is racially insensitive. And so on the one hand, they're telling us that all the guns out here are the reason we have violence. But on the other hand, you have, even in the District of Columbia, an unwillingness to go after gun laws and to actually deal with some of the issues of firearms. Then he moves to Chicago and talks about some of the things that the Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot says about the fact that the reason we have so many shootings in Chicago, which has been just an incredible slaughter of individuals over the last year and a half, that's due to out-of-state guns. And again, he points out that Chicago's own data, most violent crimes in Illinois are committed with guns purchased in the state. And then she's pushing for gun control, focusing on, of course, what are called assault rifles. And yet, if you look it up and say, how many murders in Chicago have been actually due to a rifle? And for the most recent data, which goes all the way back to 2011, which means they don't keep it up very consistently, there was actually one murder with a rifle in Chicago. So he keeps pointing out that every time you hear people promoting different kinds of attempts to address gun violence, there are very good contrary pieces of evidence that would suggest that that is not the best way to go, if indeed you really are concerned about the issue of gun violence. So, if nothing else, this whole hour has been an attempt to just say, if you dig a little deeper and you look at some of the statistics, even some of the things put together by liberal bloggers or liberal statisticians, you find out that what the media has been telling you isn't necessarily so. Next hour, we want to get into this issue of divorce. It's a very significant issue, and we thought it would be good to hear from a former divorce lawyer, and we'll talk with her right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference: Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour we're going to spend some time talking about divorce, and there's a couple of very good reasons for that. First of all, of course, every year we have about 1 million couples that file for divorce. Now, that number has gone up significantly. The best estimates are most likely a 34% increase in the number of divorces during this pandemic and lockdown. So this has always been a chronic problem and one that needs to be addressed, but it's even more significant now. And that's why we're going to spend some time talking about this book that came out in January. Before You Split, Find What You Really Want for the Future of Your Marriage. Now, I would hasten to add that you may not be thinking about a divorce, but you probably know somebody that is, or certainly have in the past wanted to, or maybe you're not married and you just simply have friends that are married. You may benefit from some of the conversation that we're going to have today, and it's one of those topics that we really felt needed to be addressed. So we go to the guest, who is the individual that has written this, and that's Toni Nieuwhof. She is a family life mediator and former divorce attorney, a co-host of Smart Family Podcast. And if the name sounds familiar, you might remember about 2 years ago we had Carrie Nieuwhof on, and we talked about his book, Didn't See It Coming. So Toni and Carrie have, in a sense, talked about their own marriage. That show surfaces certainly in the book. And it, if nothing else, helps you understand that sometimes when we talk about this issue of divorce, there are couples that go to the divorce courts every single day over an issue that other couples begin to try to work through and begin to once again develop intimacy. So that is one of the reasons we wanted to bring this book to you and this conversation. So Toni, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, it's an absolute pleasure to join you. Thanks for having me.
Might just mention, too, that a lot of people that we interview have said very nice things about your book. Matter of fact, I've known Henry Cloud since he was a student at SMU. So, Doctor, which shows you what an old fossil I am. But anyway, Dr. Henry Cloud says, divorce is a serious decision with lifelong consequences. Toni has given people an excellent way to hit the pause button and really consider what is best. So thank you, Toni, for this contribution to such a difficult process. And that's why you chose to write this, because you have seen as well, being on the other side of that issue of divorce, couples that are simply convinced that there is no way out. They're stuck. They have maybe unrealistic expectations. They're always fighting. And yet you've concluded that there are solutions to the problems that oftentimes drive individuals to the divorce court, right?
Yes, and I worked with people who expected that their divorce was going to go a certain way. You know, they'd had a conversation in advance, or a few of them, and then they decided to divorce, and then they worked through the divorce proceedings, and things didn't work out the way they expected once it actually happened. And some people were bitterly disappointed by the way it went compared to what they anticipated. And so it's a hard journey. My heart goes out to anyone who is facing a divorce or going through a divorce right now. It's a tough journey to take.
And I might just mention that we've talked on this program before, and I've written about this, and even my book on Christian ethics, it has a chapter on divorce, but I spend part of the time talking about the biblical issues, but most of the time talking about all the studies that have shown the impact that it has on the two individuals, the couple, the impact that it has, the devastating impact it has on the children, all the way to adult children of divorce. So there are all sorts of reasons to reconsider it. But let's, if we can, get to one of the themes that runs through the early part of your book, and that's what you call the mud story, of cleaning up the mud and all the issues of mud, because I thought that was a very creative way to begin to help people understand how couples find themselves in a situation where they step to the altar pledging to actually be married till death do us part. And now they find themselves wanting to go to a courtroom to end it all. And so how does that mud story fit into all of this?
Well, I didn't realize it when I was married, but the impacts of some traumatic experiences I went through as a child were showing up in our marriage, but it wasn't on my radar screen at all. So Carrie and I ended up in this long, drawn-out cycle of conflict, and it was only several years into our marriage that I started to see the clues and started to understand that there was something else going on. And I don't think that my situation is unique. I think there are many people who find themselves in their marriage responding to their spouse. You know, maybe your husband did something that was like a 2 or 3 level provocation, and my response is or your response is an 8 to 9 level on the scale of 1 to 10, and you don't know where that's coming from. Sometimes it may be related to trauma or something that has happened in your past, and your spouse is standing there, so you think that you are causing this, but the reality is that there's something more going on. There's something hidden beneath the surface, some self-limiting beliefs or hidden lies. Sometimes the enemy plants lies, and that's what I discovered was true in our marriage.
And again, that issue of escalation is something that maybe shocks one of the partners because, okay, it started out with you didn't put the cap back on the toothpaste tube, and pretty soon we're at DEFCON 3 and we're headed to DEFCON 1 and the thermonuclear meltdown over something that really wasn't that big a deal. But what's behind it are things like you don't think I'm worthy. You think I'm always late. You don't like the fact that I sometimes point out something that I'm really trying to help you with, but you take it as a criticism. So in some respects, you bring into a marriage the baggage that came from your family of origin, don't you?
Yes, exactly. And one of the lies that I give as an example in my case is that I'm better off alone. Meaning, I need to be a survivor. I need to not rely on anyone else. And trust was a big issue for me. And, in that case with Carrie and I, it started to show up as, for example, when we were trying to resolve an issue, that I would tend to zone out and withdraw and sometimes stonewall. And there was a reason for it, but sometimes it's hard to uncover the layers if you focus just on the emotions or just on the triggering. I think what God has made clear to us is that we needed to go through a healing process. We needed to get beneath the surface to try to figure out what was going on.
Well, again, one of the things I want to try to do is kind of work through the book, and so let's take a break. But when we come back, there's a whole section on I can't do this anymore, and a couple of chapters there, so we'll get into that. Then, so let's change this, and then finally towards your way, better future. So, again, some great material, about 200 pages. You should be able to find the book in your local bookstore, but if not, it's published by Waterbrook, and we have an opportunity for you to get it either in paperback or in Kindle. And Toni's with us. She has been a family law mediator, former divorce attorney, and co-host of Smart Family Podcast. And we're going to get into some of the practical aspects of divorce right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other Democratic House members considered removing an elected member of Congress and replacing her with another Democrat. That did not happen because the Democrat decided to withdraw, leaving the elected Iowa Republican in the House of Representatives. This incident raises lots of questions. The Constitution does allow Congress to disqualify an election, but that power hasn't been used in decades and has been reserved when there has been some serious misconduct. The congressional election was very close, but that hardly gave the House leadership the right to overturn an election. You may not have even heard about this possible action, which is another reason why I mention it. Imagine if 2 years from now, Republicans gain control of the House and the new Speaker of the House, likely Kevin McCarthy, decided to disqualify an elected Democrat from serving in the House. Do you think the media would ignore that abuse of power? I think we know the answer. The reason for this controversy surfaced because the election was so close. The Republican won over the Democrat by merely 6 votes out of 394,000 votes. The next time you hear someone wonder if one vote counts, remind them of this congressional election that was won by 6 votes. I've done commentaries in the past documenting elections where the margin of victory was even less. This incident also illustrates the need for election integrity. As with any election, there were questions about some of the ballots. Should they be counted or not counted? State legislatures in many parts of the country are currently considering legislation or passing legislation that should make our elections more secure. Sloppy rules and arbitrary changes in election law make contested elections more likely. The election in Iowa illustrates why we need to get it right. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
This is our topic today, and we're talking with Toni Nieuwhof about her book, Before You Split, Find What You Really Want for the Future of Your Marriage. And Mark Batterson is somebody who's been on the program with us as well many times before, and he said if you're stuck in your marriage or know someone who is, Before You Split is the practical help you're looking for. Toni Nieuwhof is not only someone we trust personally, but she's also a voice that needs to be heard when more couples than ever find themselves struggling in ways they never expected. And that gets into some of the things you've heard before as you have talked to couples considering divorce. I didn't sign up for this. I just can't do this anymore. How can marriage be this hard? This is not the same person I married. And so in some respects, those all kind of fit into the chapter of the idea that we're just stuck and we just can't get ourselves unstuck. Can you give us some hope for the fact that a stuck marriage right now saying it's really kind of dismal in the future? What kind of hope do we have for the future?
It's a good question, and I remember being in that place where, as I mentioned earlier, Carrie and I had been in this long season of conflict. So we can joke about it now and say it was the 10-year argument, but there was nothing funny about it at the time. I got to a place where I wondered, would it even be possible for me to ever be in love with Carrie again? And I'm happy to say that was about 15 years ago. At this point, we're just about to our 31st wedding anniversary, and I can say that yes, I can answer my question. Yes, it is possible. And not only that, at this point, are in a marriage that exceeds anything that either of us would have expected on our wedding day. So the journey back from our place of wondering, whether this is what the end looks like, wasn't easy. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of deliberate action, prayer. It was multifaceted, but by the grace of God, we were both relying on Jesus at that time when we really felt like we had nothing else other than Christ to hang on to.
What about using, maybe as you talk about early on, a support person or an accountability person? Because some people think, I maybe need some perspective here, not only to have somebody else look at what I'm reacting to in my spouse, but also to be humble enough, and humility is another topic that we'll get into in just a minute, humble enough to admit, it's easy to say it's all his fault or her fault, but I may be at fault there as well. And somebody providing some perspective sometimes can help, can't they?
Absolutely. As we went through our healing journey, our small group that we were a part of was critical for us, just to encourage us. We could rely on them for prayer, and also close friends. I had a couple of close friends who knew what was going on at the time, and sometimes when I was venting about Carrie, my friend would listen. She'd be empathetic, but then she'd say, she'd remind me of all of Carrie's good qualities, his loyalty and his everything that he brought to our marriage that I wasn't seeing when I was in that stuck place.
Yes, and I found that sometimes men or women can take the best qualities they see in a number of other people of the opposite sex and say, now that's my ideal man or my ideal woman. And there's nobody on this planet that actually is perfect with their finances, perfect with their grooming habits, perfect with their compliments, perfect with their ability to be a good lover and all the things that would be there, and yet you sort of pull those together so somebody's can, as you said, remind you that there are really quite a number of qualities about Carrie that maybe you're missing right now, so that's helpful. What about this chapter on being unrealistic? It does seem to me that in some respects we're talking about adjusting expectations, and maybe it's helpful, as you point out here, to identify and categorize your expectations, talk with your spouse about what those expectations are, and then somewhere along the line, if need be, get a trusted outside source or get some level of accountability. Tell us how you work through that particular issue.
Yes. Well, the example I gave is about struggles that Carrie and I had with finances. And I think this is a common problem. I know that it is. I know that I saw it in my divorce law practice over and over. People would have completely different ideas on what to do with finances, and they came into marriage with expectations that were so different that they had a hard time reconciling them. And it is an important issue because often those expectations are things that we haven't talked about, or we haven't talked about them in the context that we find ourselves in now, and so they're unspoken, and we get triggered because our emotions are attached to some of these expectations, whether it's over finances or lifestyle or vacations or spending time with in-laws. There are all kinds of different topics that we have. We have some pretty hard, firmly fastened expectations, and when our emotions are triggered, then sometimes the argument goes from bad to worse. And so it's so important to recognize when something's getting heated, that there's got to be something underneath that. And if you can step back, wait until you're calm again, and go back to the issue and go back to it with the perspective of, okay, what was the expectation I was bringing into this, and what expectation were you bringing? And then each of you can examine them on your own individually so that you can understand them better, but then come together and have a conversation where you can hear what the other person has to say and why. So you can work on adjusting your expectations by taking a breath, not letting your emotions take you out, and staying in that conversation, even if you have to come back to it 2 or 3 times, so that you can adjust expectations where they're unrealistic, or maybe they've become unrealistic.
And you even talk about a plan, and in your case, that works pretty easily because that's called a budget. But you still spend some time, talking to a seasoned businessman and trying to maybe consult with an independent financial analyst. And so in some respects, because you were dealing with money, it's still difficult because, you're feeling anxious because you don't feel like you're saving enough for the future, and he's feel like everything's just fine. But for some of these others, making a plan isn't going to be as easy as putting together a budget, but it can still be one about, writing down expectations about work, time home, travel, whatever those things are that are the conflict issues. By having them written down in a plan, then you both can see that, and then when you react to it, you realize, oh no, we did have a compromise here. We did agree that this was the plan, and if we work the plan and stay on the plan, we actually are going to feel a lot better about that. But when they're unspoken expectations, anything can trigger you, and you really have no point, no real basis upon any kind of conversation, because after all, you're coming at it from 2 entirely different viewpoints on that particular issue.
Yeah, and I think you've just hit on something really important, that often when we're divided on an issue, it seems like it's binary. So, I've got my position, Carrie has his. The reality is, for most of the issues you face, there's far more than 2 solutions. And sometimes that polarized argument gets personal, and then we start making, we might start sliding into personal insults or judgments, and that's not going to help. And so it's so important to try to dig out that creativity that you may not think you have. I mean, I've heard many people say, well, I'm not creative, but actually if you can slow down, calm down your emotions, and try to come at the issue with more creativity, more of an attitude that's open to brainstorming. And it takes practice to be able to do that, but it's a lot more helpful because often it's not just my way or your way. There's a way that we can find a shared solution that we can both live with.
Very good. Let's take a break, and when we come back, how to move closer instead of moving on. What about the issue of fighting, even the impact that divorce has on children, the conflict it does, the issue of forgiveness, humility, and a number of others, all part of this book, Before You Split. Find what you really want for the future of your marriage. Toni Nieuwhof with us, and we are privileged to have her for the rest of the hour. And if you have a comment or a question, you can join us, 1-800-351-1212, or sit back and learn a little bit more about this. And if you find yourself saying you'd like a copy of the book, it's at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue your conversation today with Toni Nieuwhof as we talk about her book, Before You Split, Find What You Really Want for the Future of Your Marriage. And Toni, I thought we might focus a little bit of time and attention on that section on how to move closer instead of moving on. You've got 3 very good tips, which you describe in some detail. And the first is what you call avoid the blame-shame game. And it does seem to me that, again, you share out of your own experience, but for broadly really applying this, that is part of the problem, is that even some of the statements that are made, they weren't intended to be blamed, but they are perceived that way, or maybe you are blaming someone and you're causing a sense of shame. Can you explain that a little better?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that our human tendency to blame, goes right back to Genesis. Right at the beginning of the Bible, we see that play out between Adam and Eve and the serpent. And that same kind of tendency shows up in our marriages, that it's far easier to point the finger and blame my spouse for something than it is to look at myself and what my part might be. And, we can tell when we're stuck in that viewpoint because our language tends to reflect it. It's, you always and you never, and you didn't, or you promised but you failed. And those kinds of statements are dead giveaways that blame is at play. And I think many of our listeners would have heard this, that, I need to talk about something in terms of how I feel, how is the incident making me feel, and using I feel statements instead of accusatory statements. But it's such a common dynamic, and, we can talk about it, but once you get into the real dynamics of marriage, it's pretty easy to slide into blame, even when you're aware of it.
It certainly is. One of the other ones you talk about is validate your spouse's emotions, because, again, we've talked about escalation. Another one is what's called invalidation. Now, there's a basic concern there because we've been through this pandemic and lockdown, sometimes people's emotions are a little bit more raw. Maybe individuals, as we're going to talk about later this week, are dealing with even really true mental issues, and so you don't want to always validate an irrational emotional feeling, or the fact that this is usually true more of the men than the women, that they've just become shut down and don't even have any emotion and just are engaged in withdrawal. But there are some times in which we have to validate a person's emotion and perspective, just so that we can be an encouragement to them, but we don't always have to agree with the emotion, because some cases it may actually be something that's illegitimate or inappropriate. True?
True. I think, but I think the key, the way I see it, is that connection. It's just that human, empathetic connection, where you can sit with your spouse's emotion, just in a similar way that Jesus, when he went to Mary and Martha and Lazarus had died, he's God, so he knew that this wasn't going to result in death. But he was still in the moment and did enter their grief. He wept. And so I think that it's okay to actually just connect in the moment, connect for a brief time, just to let your partner know that you empathize with them. But then you may need to go on and have a conversation with truth and grace about what needs to happen, because you're quite right. There are times when our emotions are raw, they're leading us down the wrong path, or I've had clinical depression before. I know what it's like to to lie on the couch and not feel like getting up. But in that case, I don't need someone to sit and cry with me for 2 days. I need someone to call the doctor for me.
Yes, and I think that's a good point, because in some respects you have to be thinking beyond your own personal needs to what is going to be best for the spouse and ultimately for your marriage, which leads to one of your other tips, because we've talked about the, if you will, the blame-shame game, and we certainly have talked about this whole idea of validating your spouse's emotions, but the other is the need for forgiveness. And if there seems to be a theme that runs through your book, it is forgiveness and humility. Can you speak to that?
The forgiveness is, that's, I think, a hot topic these days, because, there are many couples where they've been getting on each other's nerves, or they feel like their spouse hasn't been stepping up to help during the pandemic, and so it's tough. But forgiveness is, I think, something that we don't go into marriage expecting that we're going to need a practice or a habit of forgiveness, but we really do, because we're inevitably going to step on each other's toes, or worse. And so when I talk about a practice of forgiveness, I'm talking about basically like building stone steps. It's like building ancient stone steps out of 3 ingredients. The stones are justice, the mortar is mercy, and the water is humility. And it takes a messy conversation, just like you'd have a mess if you mixed water and mortar and stones to put those steps together. But when we enter into these conversations that feel messy, it feels messy to talk about the incident that actually happened, the feelings that are attached to it, to both hear each other out, and work on seeing your spouse through eyes of mercy, and then work on seeing yourself with eyes of humility. We can get through those messy conversations, though, and over time, when you practice, when you put those steps together, and over time, when you go over and over these conversations where you ask for forgiveness, or your spouse asks you for forgiveness, it becomes more of a well-worn path, and certainly those steps can take you to a higher place, higher ground in your marriage.
What about when you run into a situation where, as you pointed out, you were figuring out what your mud story is, but let's flip it around. Maybe Carrie doesn't know that you have that, or maybe you didn't know it, or your spouse doesn't know that maybe something in their past, they had an alcoholic father, they had a dysfunctional home, they felt that they had to do it on their own, they felt abandoned. In some respects, you also have to be sensitive enough to help your spouse understand what is causing him or her to be triggered by some of these events. And so how do you begin that conversation? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, it's a sensitive conversation, but it can start maybe the way Dr. Gary Chapman would put it. I've heard him put it this way before, that I love you too much to allow you to continue XYZ, fill in the blank. To continue having these angry outbursts, or to continue insulting me the way that you've been insulting me, and you're not really understanding what's going on. And so, when we have a conversation like that, then I think personally, if things have really gotten to a place where it looks like there's something underneath the surface, and chances are, unless one of you is a counselor, you don't really know what that is, it's a good time to reach out to a counselor, or to your network. Find somebody who's got a good track record. Talk to your pastor. Maybe talk to a wise mentor. But you probably are going to need to get some advice to follow that through.
So again, what we're really talking about here is maybe when we come back from the break, getting into a little bit more of what that means in terms of how you can take some steps for forgiveness. So we'll focus on some of that in terms of that, but also just the issue of fighting itself. This is devastating to the marriage. It is obviously devastating and affects the kids. Matter of fact, you have a chapter, your conflict affects your kids more than you realize, and we now know this with all sorts of studies that have been done on what's called adult children of divorce. So we're going to get into a little bit of that. And then we'll talk about leadership. After all, that was an area where your husband excels, but you have a whole section here on leaders take risks, something we talked about in our first hour today. Leaders are biased towards action, and leaders are tenacious. But we'll come back and we'll talk about fighting and forgiveness first, and those are all part of this book. Before You Split, find what what you really want for the future of your marriage. Toni Nieuwhof with us. And again, the book is available in your local bookstore, published by Waterbrook, but we also have a link so you can get it either in paperback or Kindle. And I would encourage you to learn more about that, to apply it to your own life, and then to think about how you can apply some of these principles to people around you. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Toni Nieuwhof is with us, and I wanted to talk, if we could, about this issue of fighting. Your chapter is entitled Stop Fighting, How to Make Peace Starting Now. And again, if you want to kind of summarize it quickly, you talk about the idea of the fight for we instead of me. And there is a sense in which conflict is inevitable in any relationship, including marriage. So how do we fight fair, and how do we do this in a way that actually brings about some kind of positive result?
It really requires, first of all, listening. I know that sounds so basic, but sometimes when, if there's an issue that we have expectations attached to, for example, and it's very emotional, it may be hard to actually hear what your partner is saying. And for some couples, it means that if you've got an important decision to make, you might need to collect your thoughts, decide that you're going to meet at a certain time, and one of you or both of you may want to actually write down what you want to say and write down what your position is and why you feel that way, what are the values underlying it. so that you can both hear each other. And another technique that helps people with listening is just having the person who's talking holding some object. So maybe you hold a pen, and before you give the pen to your partner so that they can speak their piece, they need to say back what you said, the gist of what you said, so that it's clear that they actually understood what you were trying to say. So listening is definitely such an important part of it. But I think the attitude that we need to find a shared solution that both of us can live with. And that means, if I'm in an argument and I'm out there strongly advocating for my position, I need to remember, if I win, we lose. Mm-hmm. Like, I can win this argument, but we're going to lose as a couple if I carry on with this tactic.
One of the things that I know you've run into as a divorce attorney is the one spouse wants to go to counseling, the other one does not. The one spouse says, we've got some major issues. The other one says, well, I don't think we have any problems, or I don't think I'm the problem. And I don't know that there's an easy way out of it, other than I have had counselors, or even on this program, say that sometimes when I'm dealing with somebody, just say, okay, can you at least admit maybe that you're not half of the problem, but maybe even you're 5% of the problem. Okay, 5% of the problem. Well, okay, if we could work on your 5%, do you think that would be better for you? And sometimes that kind of is a breakthrough, but you can only do so much. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can suggest that counseling would be helpful, but any thoughts on how to encourage the other spouse to go for counseling or to go to a trusted friend to get some advice?
Sometimes leading by example helps, and where one spouse knows that there's problems and the other one isn't on board, then I would encourage that person to go to counseling on your own. You even go and talk to a marriage counselor on your own. That's actually how Carrie and I started out. I was the first one who went to a counselor. Carrie has talked publicly about this, that he really at first felt like, well, wait a minute here, I send people to counseling, I don't go to counseling. And so he had that struggle, but then eventually we both did end up at counseling. I think sometimes when your partner sees that there's some benefit, or if they see that there's a positive change in you, then sometimes that makes it more appealing and maybe less threatening.
Just in the last few minutes we have here, you've got a whole section here just about how to begin to use this book. And I thought we might talk about that because you have, at the end of each one of the sections, some very helpful suggestions on find out what you really want. And so this is intended primarily to not just be a book that one of the spouses goes through, but both of you do. But it also could be something that could be a group study, because you have notes in the back and other material, so that if somebody wanted to even use this for a marriage enrichment session, or to maybe even deal with divorce recovery or a variety of other things, the way you've written it could be used by more than just a couple, couldn't it?
Yes, it could. Actually, I've had feedback from some pastors who are using it for groups, using it for a marriage program, for example, or for their Marriage Connect groups.
So again, that is part of it. You end with this idea of legacy, how your yes echoes into your and your family's future. And I thought that would be appropriate as well. There are times when many people, especially if they're in the midst of the pain, the conflict, the fighting, they're just thinking about their own needs. But you end with a chapter that helps people understand we're talking about much more than just your personal happiness at the moment. We're talking about the impact that this could have on your children, on your grandchildren, on the community. And that's something that couples that maybe came to you as a divorce attorney probably never thought through. So talk about that for a minute, if you might.
Well, I know what it's like to be in that painful place in your marriage where you really are just confused by all the pain and your dashed expectations about what your marriage was going to be like. And And so that's why I advise people to take it slow. That for example, if you're thinking that you need to leave your marriage for the sake of your kids, well, if it's a harmful marriage, I mean, if there is violent behavior or if it's destructive in some way, then then maybe there does need to be some separation at least. But in many cases, couples are dealing with unhappiness, and even though the emotions are confusing, I like to encourage people to take a step back. And even for the sake of your kids, you're going to have to figure out a way to bring more kindness and more respect into the ways you talk to each other, deal with each other. For the sake of your kids, you're going to be co-parents for the rest of their lives. And so, what is it that you could do now to bring more kindness into those exchanges? Maybe it's hard work. I'm not suggesting that this is easy at all, but it's definitely worthwhile.
Let me just mention that we also have a link to your website. It's ToniNieuwhof.com. Now, people say, how do I spell it? Well, that's good news. We have all of that at the website. So you simply go to pointofview.net. You'll find a link there. And there they can find out more about your Smart Family podcast, about your new book, and a variety of other resources. But that is available for anybody that would like to contact you. And what else will they find when they land on your website?
Well, there's a few additional resources that go along with the book. We talked about expectations. There's actually an accountability plan that people can use, and there's a way better future map that allows you to jot down your thoughts on each of the chapters, your own ideas for next steps for your marriage. So yes, and if anyone wants to reach out, ask me a question, or contact me through my website or through social media, I would be thrilled. So yes, please do contact me.
And we do have a link to your website, to your Facebook page, and your Twitter post. So all of it available at our website at pointofview.net. So Toni, thank you for being with us. Say hi to Carrie, and we so appreciate you writing the book and giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to take a break, and then tomorrow we're going to get into some other issues in the news and also try to explain what's happening right now with the economy. We're talking about the Federal Reserve System, a number of other topics that we'll be doing in a teaching hour, the second hour. So I think you will certainly want to join us then. But if you find yourself wanting to find out a little bit more about the book or some of the articles we mentioned in the first hour, it is all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Minnesota.